Hosea's most important prophecy was going to come to pass. Remember, Hosea said that they were not only going to grow into an immense number, but the day would come when they would be called the sons of the living God. That's a term for those people who become Christians. And he said the house of Israel and the house of Judah would be joined together again. Interestingly enough, in the book of Hebrews, which, by the way, was written to the Hebrews, we are told in the 8th chapter, verse 8, quote, "For finding fault with them, he says, Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." Yes, the words of Hosea was coming to pass. A new covenant was going to be made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. A new covenant was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah through the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, what happened to all these people? Well, the song tells us, "White boy, where will you go? What will you do? What will you see when your life is through? What can you do? Where will you go? When the people of this planet send you away from here, my boy, where do you come from? What border is your land? Everyone else knows where they come from. You don't know your place. You never did. You never can. You appeared in the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia now." Well, as we next go to a most important interview with an archaeologist and look into the historical and archaeological record, we'll find the rest of the story of where they went and where they came from. A story dealing with roots. Roots that go today all the way from America, all the way back to Abraham. I've just shown you some of Abraham's roots. What happened to those millions of people? Well, it's a most fascinating story. And though the Bible doesn't give all of that story, it is completed in the story that history tells us, in the archaeological and historical record, which we're going to cover next, right after this break. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I'm privileged to introduce to you a very special guest that has agreed to come all the way from California to help us find the answer to a question. What happened to the lost tribes of Israel? Were they ever lost? Is there any indication from an archaeological standpoint and from a historical standpoint? And to help us answer that question, we have as a special guest Raymond Capt. Mr. Capt is an archaeologist, and Mr. Capt, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation to come here to help us find the answer, what happened to those children.
Pleasure to be here.
How many years have you been an archaeologist?
Well over 40 years.
40
years, yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm going, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell the audience some of your credentials. I wrote them down here. I took them out of your book. But Mr. Capt holds a master's degree in biblical history and archaeology. He is also a fellow member of the Archaeological Institute of America. I understand you were also elected as a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland.
Yeah, a fellow, yes. Mm-hmm.
Fellow, is that the
Society of Antiquaries.
Society of Antiquaries.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a honorary doctorate degree, it says, from the Academy of Biblical Science in Italy.
Yes.
And I understand that school goes back to something like 450 AD.
450 AD, oldest school in Italy.
Amazing. And you hold an honorary doctorate degree from that. Mm-hmm. And I understand you also have, at the present time, teaching credentials. You hold teaching credentials to teach biblical history and archaeology in the state of California.
It's a designated subject, Bible history only. Mm-hmm.
You've done a marvelous job of researching history and archaeology in your book, The Missing Links Discovered, which is one of the reasons I asked you to come to help me teach my audience concerning the missing people called Israel. This book, Missing Links Discovered, is going to be available. We'll tell you towards the end of the program how you can get it. But how many years did it take you to put this book together?
I would say about 10 years putting it together.
10 years.
Not always working on that, along with other subjects, but that, at least 10 years to get it now.
It's a tremendous book, ladies and gentlemen, and he's going to give us some information from that book. Mr. Capt is responsible for shedding archaeological light upon the question, what happened to the lost tribes of the house of Israel? He is here to help us find the roots the roots of those people that came from Abraham. Or I could say it this way, the roots that go from America all the way back in history, all the way over the range of mountains called the Caucasus, to a place called Ur of Chaldees, where once there was a man by the name of Abraham, who God said was going to father a multitude of people, many nations. And of course, the question that is before us at this portion of the program is, what happened to those people that were destined to form a multitude of nations, people taken into Assyrian captivity? And though the Bible seems to be quiet at a certain spot about it, the archaeological record, I understand, Mr. Capt, is not. Does it give us any clues?
Archaeology has found the answer.
I'd like you to share the answer with my audience.
And as secular historians have really found no mention of the exiled Israelites in ancient records, we now know the reason why. It was simply because the Assyrians did not call them by the right name.
Amazing. Well, why don't you show the audience some of the slide presentations that you brought with you so that they can kind of see what you have spent a lifetime or a major portion of your life studying.
Okay, happy to. That should be on there. We're going to start our search for the lost tribes where they were last reported to be located. That is in ancient Assyria and Media. Now, this is in northern modern Iraq and Iran. Our first clue to the ultimate fate of the lost tribes was found by the archaeologists in excavating the Assyrian Royal Library at Nineveh. That is in the ruins of the palace of Sargon II. They were in the form of cuneiform tablets, such as you see here. These were actually uncovered over a century ago, translated in 1930 by Professor Waterman of the University of Michigan. But their relevance to Israel was completely overlooked. This was because they were in complete disorder among some other 1,400 other texts, and no Israel words or names appeared. One tablet, dated 707 BC, referred to a land called Gemir, which was occupied by people called Gemira or Gimera. Now, this was a very area the Israelites had been placed just 14 years previously. Gemir, we believe, is evidently a corruption of Gomri, the Assyrian name for Israel, formed by the inversion of the final syllable IR to R, I should say RI to IR. Such inversions are very common in Assyrian writings. These tablets were actually spy reports sent to the Assyrian king from a frontier post. The king being that time was Sargon. These reports covered a large period of time.
That's fascinating. Now, these reports, what did they say?
Well, among other things, they reported that the exiled Israelites were not slaves. They were actually freemen, had their own homes, they had cities, towns, engaged in various activities. They had agriculture, manufacture. Would you believe they even had their own standing army? Now, this sounds strange, but consider the fact, why were the Israelites in Assyria? Now, Assyria in the past, anytime they occupied, I should say, subjected an area, they merely sent their overseers there to extract a tribute and so on. But with the Israelites, this is an exception. They brought these men up to Assyria to act as buffers around the borders of the country. In other words, evidently they were fierce fighters in those days.
What do you mean, buffers?
Well, for instance, any outside invasion coming directed toward Assyria, they'd have to penetrate first through the Israelite lines. That means the Israelites would have to fight for their lives, either repulse the enemy or at least, you might say, weaken them before they got to Assyria proper. Now, we can prove this because one series of tablets reported the invasion of Urartu. The king of Urartu came against Assyria, and they had to penetrate first through the Israelites. Now, one of the tablets makes it very clear the Israelites put up resistance. They fought, actually repulsed the armies, and then turned around and invaded Urartu in exchange. In fact, they not only captured or killed, all of their army commanders, they even sacked the country. Now, archaeologists had known for years that capital of Urartu had been sacked and destroyed. They never knew who did it. Now the tablets for the first time reveal these were Israelites that did it.
It's fascinating. You know, it makes sense, too, that they would set them there because, in other words, if there's an invading army, they're going to have to come through their land, so they've got to defend their own land that they're working, their families, and that type of thing. That's interesting.
Another and later Assyrian report states, in the second year of Esarhaddon the king, now this is about 679 BC, the Gimera, as the Israelites were then called, rose in rebellion under their leader, Tuespa. We don't know if Tuespa was a woman or a man at this stage. They fled westward. Now, the Greeks reported these same activities. They called the Gimera Chimeroi in their records. Now, that name is translated into English as Cimmerians. Now, the branch of Israelites, now known as Cimmerians, moved out of Asia Minor, around and sometimes across the Black Sea, settling in the Crimea and the Carpathian regions west of the Black Sea. We find this called in 2nd Ezra Arsereth, or Mountains of Serth. Now, later when Babylon conquered the Assyrian Empire, this is about 612 BC, they then invaded that part of Media where the Israelites, or Gimera, that had not escaped, were still there, and settled. And that, of course, drove the Gimera out of their area, some of them moving up through the Caucasus, through what we call today the Pass of Israel. I should say that some historians refer to that as the Pass of Israel. Others moved around the east of the Caspian Sea and became known as Iskuzi, a name very easily derived from Isaac.
Then these tablets that allow us to learn these things really provide a very valuable archaeological clue, don't they?
Yes, they do. There's another major clue to tracing the lost tribes of Israel. Is found on the side of a hill in northern Persian. It's in inscribed writings about 300 feet above the base of the mountain, the hill. Now, the inscriptions were actually carved in Akkadian, Elamite, and Old Persian languages. All three told the same story. The inscriptions show that the Babylonian name Gimera was written Saka on the Persian inscription, proving that the Gimera and the Saka were the same people. Now, the Greeks called these Scythians, I should say they called the Saka, Scythians in all their records. This is the first mention of the word Scythian. It's also interesting to note that the various names of Gimera are called all have the same root, SK, as Isaac. Now, before the tribes went into exile, they called themselves the house of Isaac. You can find this in the Bible in Amos 4, verses 7 and 16, I believe. Archaeology has not only identified these Scythians as members of the lost tribes of Israel, but for the first time provided us with realistic, lifelike pictures of what the ancient Hebrews people looked like. Now, unlike the stylized pictures we see the Egyptians made and formalized or stylized stone carvings made by the Babylonians and Persians, excavated from Scythian tombs north of the Caucasus are found skillfully made gold work showing the everyday life of the Scythians. Here, two Scythian horsemen are astride their horses. Two Scythians here are fighting back to back using bows and arrows. Now, this reminds us of the little tribe of Benjamin that had, according to the Bible, 280,000 men of valor that bore shields and drew the bow. Now, to continue tracing the Israelites, under pressure from the Medes and the Persians, the Scythians, now this is the eastern branch of the Israelites, they migrated north of the Black Sea, coming into collision with the Cimmerians. Now, the Cimmerians, I consider them the western branch of the Israelites. These people had settled in the Carpathian regions. Now, their kinship, lost during the passing centuries, ensuing battles, ended with the Cimmerians being pushed out of the area, and they moved westward. The Cimmerians then broke into two major groups. The larger part migrating up the Danube River Valley, arriving at its source in South Germany between 600 and 100 BC. Now, Roman historians, they call these people Celts. This is the first mention now of the word Celt. A small group moved into the sparsely inhabited regions of the Baltic, but the Romans called them by the abbreviated name of Cimbri. Now, between the 4th and 1st centuries BC, the Sarmatians, now these are a mixed non-Israelitish people, we believe partly Iranian, were pushing westward. They finally moved into the area of the then prosperous Scythian nation. Continuing warfare then drove the Scythians out of their land, as they had done the Cimmerians, and the majority northward toward the Baltic areas. Now, by the end of the 2nd century BC, we find only two small pockets of Scythians left on the shores of the Black Sea. Now, the Scythians, in turn, pushed the Cimbri westward to Jutland and the coast of Holland. Now, during this period of time, the Celts were expanding in all directions, many of them pouring into Britain to form the bedrock of the British race. About 3000 BC, some of the Celts invaded Italy. and sacked Rome. Others migrated back into Asia Minor, where they were called Galatians by the Greeks. We now know that Paul's letters to the Galatians were to his kinsmen Israelites, that is, descendants of the earlier Galatians, although called Gentiles by the modern Bible translators.
You know, that really helps to clear up to a degree, or major degree, this term Gentile. A lot of people have a lot of problems with it, but the word itself is ethnos, and it means nations.
That's right.
And what you're talking about here are nations, and of course God told Abraham his seed was going to form a multitude of nations.
Those nations would definitely be Israelites. Now, as the Sarmatians occupied Scythia in South Russia, there was a tendency to confuse them with the Sarmatians, because people are usually identified by the name of the land they live in. Now, the Romans, they solved the problem. They introduced the word Germans for Scythians. Now, the word genuine, or genuine, I should say, is Germanus or Germani. That's the Latin word for genuine. So in all the Roman records, except for a few outland areas, they dropped the name Scythian in all the Roman records. They applied the word Sarmatians or Germans. Now, from that, well, I guess you get the picture. German.
Oh, it's fascinating, yes.
Now, don't think for a minute we're talking about the German nation today.
Right.
The Cimbri were eventually driven out of northwest Europe. One group migrated to Italy, were nearly all wiped out by the Romans. One group made their way back into Spain to be known as Ibrius. Now, Ibrius is the Gaelic name for Hebrews. And eventually, many of those migrated into the Ireland as Scots. They named the island Hibernia, that early name for Ireland, a name that still exists. One group crossed the English Channel into northern Britain to form form the roots of the nation of the Picts. Now, during the succeeding centuries, the Scythian Germanic peoples broke into many divisions, possibly in some instances into their original Israel tribal families, like the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Danes, and Vikings, to name just a few. Now, between 450 and 600 AD, some of the Angles and Saxons moved into Britain as Anglo-Saxons. The Celtic Scots, for the most part, moved into northern Britain and established the nation of Scotland, although some settled in northern Wales, the Isles of Man, the Scilly Islands. Now, many Germanic tribes poured into the land south, that is, after the Celts began to move out and vacate the land. These Germanic tribes established the Gothic nations, the Vandals, Lombards, Franks, Burgundians, Visigoths, Ostrogoths. These Scythian Germanic people, or tribes, formed the modern German, Swiss, French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese nations of the day, although there has been, over the centuries, an infusion of non-Israel blood in these nations. The northern Scythian Israelites that had settled in Scandinavia, we read of them in history, raiding and establishing colonies in Western Europe, Britain, and Ireland. One group settled in France became known as Normans, who later forced their way into England under William the Conqueror in 1066. What happened to the lost tribes of Israel? You now know the answer. They were never really lost. They only lost their identity as they migrated over the centuries westward.
You know, suddenly when you put the historical research that you have in your book, The Missing Links, and you couple the cuneiform tablets of the Assyrian Empire that you have studied, suddenly you have the keys that not only show they were not lost, but that God was keeping his promise all along, wasn't he? He said they would go to the north, to the south, the east, and the west. There's one thing that came to my mind as you were talking, and I brought this out in an earlier teaching, and that is Ephraim and Manasseh. Then it seems like what you're saying there, that these people formed the bedrock of the British nation, which formed a multitude of nations themselves. It would almost seem then that they at least represented, or in a representative way, one of these children, Ephraim and Manasseh. What do you think?
You're right. I'd like to add one other point. Our Celto-Saxon ancestors, they first settled in Western Europe and in Scandinavia, in the Isles of the West, in fulfillment of Jeremiah 31, verse 10, which reads, "Hear the word of the Lord, O you nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, He that scattereth Israel shall gather him, and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock." I believe America is a regathering of Israel, where we have been, as was prophesied in the Bible, quote, blind to our identity. I believe that we whose roots are traced back to Abraham are Abraham's children, of which God said, as long as the sun, moon, and stars exist, so will the descendants of Abraham continue as a nation before me. I would like to end with one of my favorite Bible verses. Know ye the Lord is God, is he who has made us, not we ourselves, and we are his people and the sheep of his pasture.
Amen. I really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your research with our audience. And I started this program with a song that came from the 60s or 70s, a rock group singing White Boy. In fact, I think I'm going to have it played again because it asks a question, or at least makes a statement that I think now we have the answer. Let's listen to the song again.
Where will you go? What will you do? What will you see when your life is through? What can you do? Where will you go when the people of this planet send you away from here, my boy? Where do you come from? White boy, what is your land? Everybody else knows where they come from. You don't know your place, you never did, you never can, and you can't find a home in this land. Blacks and reds and Apaches, Jews, all know where they come from, but you don't seem to know. Baby, do you understand?
I just wanted you to hear those words of that song, and I've got the lyrics here. The lyrics dealing with a question that was being asked in the 60s and the 70s by a baby boom generation that seemed to have lost their spiritual moorings. The question was, who am I? And the song said, white boy, where will you go? What will you do? What will you see when your life is through? Blacks and Reds and Apaches and Jews all know where they came from, but you don't seem to know. Baby, do you understand? You appeared in the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia now. Amazing lyrics when you begin to study the lineage of a man called Abraham and look into the roots that go all the way back. And the question, I guess, is now, do you understand? Do you understand that the children of Israel were really never lost at all? As you have heard in this presentation, the names were changed. The Assyrians in their tablets had used different terms, but we know those people were the same people, and they fulfilled the words, and the words of God still stand. A multitude of people going in many directions to form many nations. Mr. Capt's book, Missing Links Discovered, is one that I would recommend to you. If you would like to have this book, Missing Links Discovered, I would highly recommend you order it. It's available from our ministry for a $10 offering. The address is just simply Truth for the Times, P.O. Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535. What you've heard in this brief interview with Mr. Capt has just been a portion of a whole wealth of information that's in the book. For example, Mr. Capt, I noticed you spent a whole chapter comparing the similarities between the Hebrew language and the English language.
The ancient British language is the Welsh Gaelic. We find that almost all the words can be matched up with Hebrew words. I made a test one time. I was in Wales, and I had a Welshman I spent the night with, and I asked him, he'd give him some words in Hebrew, and to look at his Welsh words. He realized he could read Hebrew without even knowing he could, by tracing the word was so similar, the Welsh word and the English word. In fact, all the roots of the Hebrew word, Gaelic words can be traced right back to Hebrew. So
Fascinating.
he was surprised.
Yeah. Well, you'll also be surprised, ladies and gentlemen, in this book of the chapter dealing with the heraldry of these people in comparison to today's symbolism. So, book that I would highly recommend. Go ahead.
That would be one of the links. The book, there's more than one link in that book. One of the links is heraldry. We find the tribes of Israel all had certain instances in heraldry. We find that same pictures in England and Saxon and Scandinavian heraldry. The same heraldry, you might say, the emblems. So there's a connection there.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to find all the links, order the book. It's well worth reading, ordering, having in your library. I am privileged to have Mr. Capt as a guest to give us information that's taken him, 40 years of his life as he's gathered and studied in the field of archaeology. Mr. Capt, I know you have an entire slide presentation called Nothing But the, that deals with nothing but the migrations of Israel. And it's called Migrations of Israel.
It's called Migrations of Israel, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, that slide presentation really put the picture together, so to speak, in the puzzle for me. And I was wondering if sometime you would be willing to come back for another Truth for the Times broadcast and just give that presentation on a slide.
I'd be very pleased to. Now, some of the slides, of course, would be duplications, the ones that I showed today. But I have a lot more I didn't show. And I give them complete stories starting from Abraham. I'll be sort of overlapping some of the material you go into. But to give the complete story, tracing these people right on through to America.
And I want to thank you for allowing me to use those slides as well, Mr. Capt. I know
pleasure.
They're very valuable. And speaking of America, now maybe those in America might understand a little better their roots. You see, the people that came to America, when they came, they read 2 Samuel 7:14, where God had promised another land, a new land. And those people we call the pilgrims, really then, their roots go all the way back to these Bible characters. And hopefully now you understand concerning the story of the lost tribes of Israel and the roots that go from America all the way back over the Caucasus Mountains to a man named Abraham. Mr. Capt, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure being here.
I really appreciate that. Hello again. I'm Pastor Peters, and I do hope and pray that you enjoyed the message, Roots from America to Abraham. That message was simply designed to introduce you to a truth that can change your life, that can help you understand the events that are going on in the world today, and that can make the Bible an understandable and applicable book. For those of you that want more truth on this subject, more information, we have some books to offer you. Years ago, I wrote this book called The Greatest Discovery of Our Age. It is written from a biblical standpoint. It also has some additional appendixes in it, but it will help you in discovering this truth. Many people have found this truth simply by reading that book. It's available for a $3 offering. Ray Capt himself wrote a small book called The Abrahamic Covenant. The Abrahamic Covenant, a study outline of the identity of God's people. And Ray Capt has done a superb job in putting the whole truth into a small package in this little booklet, which is available also for a $2 offering. Ray Capt's book called Missing Links Discovered approaches this truth from a standpoint of history and archaeology, heraldry, language, and so forth. It's a superb book to have on your library shelf. It's available for a $10 offering. Now, for those of you that are Bible scholars, I want to recommend a book that helped me find this truth from a biblical perspective. The book is called Judah's Scepter and Joseph's Birthright. It was written by J.H. Allen in 1901, and it does a superb job of taking you from the book of Genesis, right from there all the way through God's covenant that he made with Abraham to the New Testament scriptures, and it will give you an understanding of the Bible you've never seen before. Now, this book is a little bit heavy reading. It's for those that are Bible scholars and are wanting to sit down and prove whether or not the things that we have said are so. For those of you that would like to know the greatest love story never told, this is a book that I have written which will introduce you to the greatest love story never told. Do you know about God's marriage to his wife and her unfaithfulness and the divorce and how he promised to remarry and how the new Christian covenant fits into all of this story? Well, this is a book that you need to read if you don't know the greatest love story never told. These books are available. The Greatest Love Story is available for a $5 offering. The Judas Scepter and Joseph's Birthright for an $8 offering. And if you want to write to us for additional information or for these books, our mailing address is Truth for the Times, P.O. Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535. And you know it's time that this truth be told, and it is being told, and we pray that you find it. Thank you.